consultation phase. It stemmed from the review of secondary education, which the former government conducted starting in 2022 through 2023. Last year, with the NT election, there was a bit of a pause on the reform activity before it commenced in earnest again in around September last year, following the election of the CLP government. The reform of secondary really targeted or identified a secondary system that would fulfill these visions. So we're seeking for an excellent and equitable secondary system. So that meant that both the delivery of secondary education was really high quality in the Territory, but also that it was available where students wanted to go to school. That brings us to the second dot point or second vision statement, which was a guaranteed standard of local secondary service provision. So that means that students across the Territory would be given a pathway to the NT Certificate of Education and Training and have that pathway to complete regardless of where they lived. For those of you that knew the system prior or the current system, in many of our remote and regional communities, there's very limited access to year 10s, 11s and 12 subjects. And in order to access those subjects, many students either have to have to enrol through the School of Distance Education or attend boarding school. The third was that we're seeking a model that was differentiated. So that meant that there'd be different options and different pathways available to kids. It wasn't all just a cookie cutter and it wasn't all the same in all places. So it was premised on the fact that we should have a high quality system everywhere, but we should also offer opportunities for specialisation where we have them across the Territory. The second last was a learning design that guaranteed core literacy, numeracy and work readiness and drove improvements in school attendance and wellbeing. And finally, there was an NT government election commitment to shift away from the model of middle schooling, which was the fundamental recommendation of the review of secondary. So throughout February, March and into April, the reform team, which I lead, conducted consultations with school councils, with staff groups across the Territory or within Darwin, Palmerston, Alice Springs, and also with students through their schools, through their school bodies. We also ran a public survey at the time, and across the period it was open, we got about 1,100 responses to that survey. So what the consultation told us was that generally there's a high degree of support for the move away from middle schools and certainly the options that we propose. So in our survey responses, 85% of teaching staff were supportive, very supportive or neutral on the proposed, 77% of parents and 79% of students. So strong support. But what we heard through that consultation was there's a whole range of different considerations we need to take into account as we move towards full comprehensive or the new secondary system. Some of those are recommendations around timing and sequencing, others around literacy or around the infrastructure and requirements for infrastructure. We also got a lot of feedback from students around how best to manage, particularly the younger middle year students in their transition into a full comprehensive, and some of the safeguards we need to put in place and we would put in place to support year 7s being in the same school as year 12s, which has been a while for many families in the Territory. So the final design that was agreed by government was that we consulted on, which I'll run through in a moment, with one exception, which is that the government agreed to delay the implementation in Alice Springs by a year based on the advocacy of the School Council for Centralian Middle and Centralian Senior, as well as the AU branch of the Alice Springs branch of the AEU. So I'll go through what's proposed or what we're working towards now. So for Darwin, we will be transitioning the 4 middle schools or the 3 standalone middle schools at Dripstone, Nightcliff and Sanderson to be great full comprehensive schools. So from 2026, year 10 or Dripstone, Nightcliff and Sanderson will begin offering a year 10 curriculum and a year 10 delivery, which will slowly expand through 2027 into 2028 to make them full comprehensive year 7 to 12 schools by 2028. For Darwin and Middle and Darwin High, we proposed and the government agreed that we would combine those schools into a single school in the period out to 2028. So that planning work will start now, will commence in earnest in 2026, and then we'll work to the full integration of the 2 schools by 2028. We've also committed to establish a industry, trade and technical college on the site of the Sanderson Middle School. So that will be in addition to the full comprehensive school there, and will provide a pathway for students in partnership with industry that want to explore those trade careers. So we'll be looking at targeting industries in demand for the territory. So construction is an obvious one, but many human service delivery paths, vocational paths, are also in demand for the territory. There's also great gas development opportunities as well as other development opportunities that we'd focus on through the technical college. And then finally, for Casuarina Senior College, they will shift their focus to be a higher education focused college focused on professions in great demand. So initially it'll be focused on healthcare with the expansion to teaching. We always need more teachers in the territory and across Australia, and then looking at other professions where there's a great need in the territory. For Palmerston, the proposal is to take the two campuses, what's been agreed by government is to take the two campuses of Palmerston College and establish two full comprehensive schools in the Palmerston area. So at Driver, that school where the existing Driver campus of Palmerston College is, will convert into a year 7 to 12, commencing from next year with the year 7 cohort joining the years 10, 11 and 12. The following year, they'll offer year 8, and then the following year, they'll offer year 9. The Driver campus will have a very close link to the Palmerston Youth Skills Centre and provide a similar technical annex to the Driver campus to support for the students at Driver accessing those specific vocational pathways that they wish to explore. On the other side of Palmerston at the Rosebery campus, they're currently the middle school from grades 7, 8 and 9. From next year, they'll be offering a year 10 and that'll follow a year 11 and a year 12 by 2028, bringing that school to full comprehensive by the end of 2028 with the first graduating class. The two schools will have priority enrolment areas across the region, which are highlighted on the map there in blue and orange. And these are the priority enrolment areas that we consulted on earlier in the year. So for those that know Palmerston, the north-south boundary is largely Chungla Terrace, which aligns to the existing priority enrolment areas of the 3 primary schools on the eastern side, as well as the 4 primary schools on the western side. In making this recommendation, the department's aware that that does create a disparity between the socioeconomic characteristics of the suburbs that feed into the school. And so we'll be planning to balance and to provide appropriate levels of support to both schools to ensure that that doesn't become entrenched disadvantage in the region. For Alice Springs, the proposal that we consulted on and what was agreed by government was that the Centralian Middle School would slowly transition to a full comprehensive school. That transition would commence in 2027, so not next year, the year after, with the year 10 cohort staying on in 2027, followed by a transition in 2028 when both the year 11 and year 12 cohorts would continue at the Centralian Middle site. The reason for slower commencement than the other schools as proposed is that we received lots of strong feedback from the community in Central Australia around the time needed to do this properly. But it also reflects the need to focus on improvements at Centralian Middle School and embed some of the improvements that have been going on at Centralian Senior College. So there's some work there to build on the success or relative success of both schools. So for Centralian Senior, that will convert into an industry, trade and flexible education college, which would be associated with the new comprehensive high school in Central Australia. So the timeframes and what we're on to at the moment is we've now got a government decision, so it's week 2 of term 3, and we are in full change implementation planning. So we've been working with school principals across the board whilst government has been deliberating on this to make sure that we've got all of the ducks in a row, so to speak, so that we can start implementation from the start of 2026. So there's a whole range of different factors we're taking into account. Some are infrastructure improvements that are required to get the middle school infrastructure up to state for senior secondary delivery. We're working on what school leadership looks like, what the staffing requirements are. There's professional development scheduled for staff across the board, as well as curriculum planning development and learning model development for our middle schools. We're also then focused on supporting and working with the primary schools to make sure that the transition of the Year 6 cohort next year is seamless. For most students, or most Year 6 students across the territory, they will continue to go to the school that they were expecting to go to last year. So for most of Darwin, there is no change to the priority enrolment areas for the Year 6s going into Year 7. So if your child's at Ludmilla, they'll still go into Darwin Middle as the priority enrolment area, likewise for Dripstone, Sanderson and Nightcliff. The change for Year 6 students is largely limited to Palmerston, where the Year 6 students formerly would have all gone into Year 7 at the Rosebery campus of Palmerston College. From next year, those Year 6 students will split between the two new schools at the Driver campus and the Rosebery campus. So just to provide some assurances that we're working through the change management process, which is a formal mechanism in government for us to manage the impact on staff, but also want to work with school communities and school councils on how best to support the community and the students through this process. I can confirm that there's not going to be any job losses. We need all the teachers we've got, as well as school staff that we've got. And there will be a resource boost associated with this transition to support schools that are building their capacity and building their cohort over the period. So, for example, we might expect a smaller Year 10 cohort at schools like Nightcliff and Sanderson for next year. We're committed to support those schools with the resourcing they need to provide a really great offering for those Year 10 students that do choose to go to those schools. We are talking to the Australian Education Union and NT NTCOGSO, as well as NT Principals Association, about how best to manage the change. I've already been through some of the implications on implementation, but there's other things like choosing a name for the new schools. We've got a fairly stringent naming policy in the NT government, but there is there's some opportunity for schools to determine what they think the appropriate naming for their school might be in the future. So there's a process to go through, and many schools have already started consulting on that. Likewise, we're looking at some school leadership. We are creating 2 new schools in Palmerston and a new school in Darwin, so we'll be seeking to recruit to leadership at those schools. There's branding, there's uniforms, there's the workforce planning, as well as really looking at the specialisations that might be available across the board and how we best support each school to do what it does best. There's things like bus routes and making sure that all our kids can get to school and that the buses are best supporting the local cohort rather than sending everybody up to the interchange and then dispersing them from there. And lastly, we're focused on the transition of students as well and making sure we've got the right wellbeing support in place for students that are transitioning to these new schools. But also, we've also got a particular focus on students with additional needs or students with disability to make sure that they're well supported in this transition and are aware of what their choices are in the system. I might stop the presentation there and I'll invite questions or comments. Perhaps raise your hand if you've got a question. I might pick on people if nobody has a question. Right.
I'll go to start it if you want, David. So thanks very much for the presentation. And I just wanted to also acknowledge that we really appreciate that our concerns for Central Australian Middle School were acknowledged and that was taken into account. And I think we're going to have a much better sort of combined high school by having the extra time. So that's we're tremendously grateful for that. So thank you very much. I did want to just check in with you because I think some of our concerns from Central Australian Middle School were just about school infrastructure, classrooms, indoor space. You know, we use the gym as a hall, but it's pretty terrible. And, you know, the staff need more space. We need separate spaces for, say, you know, year 10s and year 11s and year 12s. Can we expect there to be actual sort of, you know, building works? I mean, I know there wasn't a huge amount of money put aside for infrastructure, but is there the potential that that can change?
Yeah, so a couple of things in that, Brian, which I'll respond to. So infrastructure budget for next year to support this change, we've got $3 million in our capital budget to support it. That'll largely be focused on the fit outs in middle schools to make sure that they're ready to take that senior secondary cohort. We'll be watching that money closely because I anticipate it won't be enough. So we'll be making sure that as we prioritise, and particularly for Centralian Middle, we're identifying the projects that are needed to get you off the ground. And I hear what you're saying around your hall, and we'll certainly be talking about swampies versus other types of cooling at some stage, I'm sure. There is an opportunity to go back to government around major infrastructure development at some of our sites that simply don't have the space to accommodate what we hope will be their enrolments by 2030. So we've still to go through that process.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
I've got Simon Turner next on my list. If you don't mind turning your camera.
Hello. So Simon Turner, I'm from Darwin Middle School. Obviously, we've sent through a letter through to the department just advising them that due to the delays in the implementation of this, we've got real concerns about the ability of this to happen for next year. I haven't seen a response to that letter as of yet, and I guess you would be aware that we've lost our principal, partly due to this uncertainty. So, yeah, I don't know whether it's just a comment or whether there's a response that you can really give on that. And then I guess the second part of the question is that $3 million per school, or is that $3 million spread across 20 schools? Because you're not going to get much for $3 million across 20 schools.
Agree. So I'll answer the first and then the second point. So yes, received the letter, Simon, and obviously with the announcement today, we had some dependencies to work through. What we are planning for the slow transition at Darwin Middle and Darwin High is we're not expecting, the department's certainly not expecting a fully integrated school ready to start from the start of 2026. There's a lot of work to go through that you and Simon and Max have outlined, as well as school leadership, around what the combined school looks like, how to best manage the governance arrangements as we've got two independent public schools coming together, and also how to best manage the integration of staff and kids across the campuses. So I'm anticipating that the Darwin Middle and Darwin High start the school year as two separate entities, continuing where they are at the moment, and then through the work across the last 6 months of this year, but the 12 months following that, we'll work through what a full integration of those campuses look like. We're not trying to rush you, Simon, to get it all done by the end of the year, because appreciate there's a lot to work through across those two sites. Going to your second point about the $3 million, it is across the 9 affected secondary schools, but will be shared probably between 6 or 7 of them, as we have other infrastructure projects on foot. But I can't go into the detail around that, as we're still working through the prioritisation at this stage. So thank you. I expect Simon Niblock, you've got a follow up, but I might go to John and then come back. Go to John Oliver and then come back to you. John?
Hey, David. Hey, I'm just inquiring. You mentioned that as part of the splitting of the two schools in Palmerston, the driver campus will be using the Palmerston New Skills Centre. Yep. So is there going to be a model change for the Palmerston New Skills Centre that'll only be operating through the driver campus, or will that be still accessible by other schools?
So the plan is to have it still accessible to other schools as well, John, and appreciate that 2 million kids and a lot of kids within Palmerston are accessing that facility, but to strengthen the provisioning and really tie it to some of the industry jobs that are coming up right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Oliver?
Thanks, David. I was just going to ask around plans for working groups to identify priority infrastructure needs. So obviously Darwin Middle to Darwin High, yes, they're on the same broader campus, but there's a few hundred metres between each. And obviously the board has been thinking through some of the logistical challenges of, where students, how they might cohabitate, etc. So is there an opportunity? Is that part of the thinking? I don't expect you to go into details now, but that was really the question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, and I'll acknowledge that I think we stepped it out, Simon, the block, that there's 887 metres between the two corner blocks between the two schools, which is quite a long way. So I guess part of the planning for the latter part of this year and for next year is working out how to make that work. Schools like Taminmin already offer a 7 to 12, but they do it through almost separate campuses on the same site, with the students intermingling around some of the specialised facilities. We'd be working with the boards of Darwin Middle and Darwin High, as well as the leadership teams across those schools, to work out how best, how the school best wants to operate, but also what is the infrastructure requirements to best support that. But yeah, $3 million isn't going to go an awful long way. So we'll be prioritising that funding based on the immediate need in order to service the students that are showing up next year.
Yeah, thank you.
Simon, you had your hand up and now it's down again.
Yeah, I did. Thanks very much, David. And a quick question regarding the money. I mean, $3 million, as you said, is not going to go very, very far. In terms of governance, which is sort of why we're all here tonight, we're all in governing bodies. Every school, whether or not they're a merger, Darwin Middle, Darwin High School, or a Nightcliff Middle turning to high school, the governance will change. And I think there is an opportunity there for the department to have a good discussions with COGSO and the schools about how do you actually really optimise the potential to improve governance across all schools. Like, this is the chance to kind of crack things open and have a really good look at what works. So I'm hoping that we might see some resources put into facilitating discussions and training for boards, for councils, and I think really importantly for staff, so that you can actually maximise the synergies that are going to come out of this.
Yeah, great point, Simon, and absolutely agree. There is an opportunity. I might throw to Michelle Parker, who I can see sitting somewhere on my screen, about what the opportunities are through improved governance. And I think COGSO's already started giving this some thought.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Simon. We've commenced with two things. One, Simon's talking more broadly about improving governance and the type of governance and the depth of governance in schools, I would imagine. So I might hand back to you in a sec, Simon. But in terms of the things that we flagged, so I think it was back in April, we sent to the department a list of things that we wanted to alert the department to in terms of governance around schools changing names, around compliance with the ATO, with gazettal processes, with consultation, informing new school bodies and merging. So we're across in terms of the Education Act and the compliance around what the list of all those things will be, and I'm happy to send that through to everybody tomorrow. So we're working in partnership and collaboration around making sure that the things that need to be picked up around finances and resources and compliance are happening. David and I had a conversation recently around the gazettal process, and I'll hand back to you, David, to talk about that, around the timing for that. And as you're aware, some of these governance issues around name changes, we're looking, and some of the feedback questions that I've got here from people who couldn't be here is around how will community be consulted, or the parent bodies, rather than just schools in determining names and uniforms and things. Obviously in Centralian, there's another year for that, so you'll be able, Rowan and Anna and Lara Pinter, to learn from what happens up here, and you'll have another year for that to happen. And I'm hearing from you, David, that for Darwin Middle and Darwin High, there's another year as well. Is that correct?
Well, So we're not expecting Darwin Middle and Darwin High to be one entity from the start of the school year, appreciating that they've got to work through it. So when we say another year, as we say with Centralian Middle and Centralian Senior, it's a year to do the work to get ready to full integration. It's not I guess, a year delay. There's an awful lot that needs to be done across both Central and the Darwin sites.
Yeah, which will really help with that that governance in terms of the mechanics. But I think, Simon, and I'll hand to you now if that's okay, and then back to you, David. Simon, you're talking a bit deeper around models that may be different from what we currently have for governance and reviewing that, if I've read that right.
Yeah, good question. I mean, in the case of Darwin High School, Darwin Middle School, absolutely. It will be 2 school boards turning into 1 school board. So is that opportunity to think, how do we do things differently? It's a change across the board that I think just begs the question and the opportunity to just look at how things are working. It's not necessarily a wholesale restructure of the model that we have, but are there ways in which we can improve it? And now is really good time to do it, when you're actually making these changes to get the community, the school community, and the parents involved.
Yeah.
But I did have one further question to that, which is your point about middle school and the high school, Darwin Middle, Darwin High, and it is a bit specific to those schools. You say they will continue operating for the next sort of 12 months as they are. Does that mean separate schools with separate boards?
So we are not proposing to change the structure of both those schools for the start of next year. So the way that that's governed under the Education Act is each of those entities need a governing board. We will take the advice from the 2 independent boards, how you think we best need to manage that, whether it's a joint board managing both of the schools, whether you feel like there is independent boards and then opportunities to come together. But that's work we'll need to do with you and Max, Simon, around how best to approach the change.
Yep, interesting. Thank you.
As far as entity goes, there'll be 2 separate bank accounts at the start of next year.
And just recognising, David, that that under the Education Act, there's the types that we have now: the Independent Public School Board, the school council, under school rep bodies. So are you considering any legislative changes in terms of what you're talking about with Darwin High and Darwin Middle, about how they may have ideas for a different way of the 2 boards operating?
We'll take that on board if there are changes proposed. We hadn't identified any for this year or next year. But if through this process it works out there needs to be a more novel form of governance established or an alternate, happy to entertain that as well. So I think separately we're committed to continue to review independent public schools and make sure that the legislation is fit for purpose. So if through this there's an opportunity to amend that as well, that school representative bodies or independent public school boards feel we should take, then happy to explore it.
Great, thanks. And just one last quick one. So for the students, the only change for students is at the 2 campuses at Palmerston, the middle schools in Darwin from January 2026. Is that right, for students?
Yeah, so for most of the Year 6 students, there's no change to what would have happened had we not made any changes to the system, with the exception of Palmerston. So the kids in Malden, Woodruff, Grey, Driver and Durack primary schools, or those priority enrolment areas, will be feeding into the Driver campus, so the high school at the Driver campus, and the students in Year 6 this year in Rosebery, Bakewell and Zaccoli will be feeding into Year 7 at the Rosebery campus. So Palmerston College has already started some of that transition planning, and I think has offered families an opportunity to look at both sites. That'll be more focused from here, where we start to really link those primary schools through to the new secondary schools. For the Year 10 cohort, it's a different story. So the Year 10s will have the opportunity across the board in Darwin and Palmerston to stay at the school that they're attending now. So that's Dripstone, Nightcliff and Sanderson, and at Palmerston, continuing through to Year 10 in the current site.
And for Darwin High and Middle, the same?
Yep, Darwin High Middle won't change for next year. So the priority enrolment area for Darwin Middle will maintain or stay as it is for next year.
And students will stay 7 to 9 at the middle campus and 10 to 12 at the senior campus.
Yep.
Is that? Yeah. Thank you.
All right, welcome, Leanne. Any other questions? Concerns? Hi, Anna.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. I suppose, you know, particularly for CMS and CSC, there'll be quite a change in the requirements for funding in terms of CMS. Probably, I imagine, having a lot more students there. I suppose, like, how much planning has been done around those expected funding changes into the years to come has already been done, and what sort of time frame do you think that information will be made available to school councils and the schools around that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Anna. Did I catch you, the treasurer at Centralia Middle School? I might have. So we've been working on, I guess, models trying to predict how many students are going to go which ways next year. And we'll be looking at resourcing based on the projected enrolments at schools, but balance that with the minimum sustainable cohort required to support a program. So what that largely means is that at the moment, secondary schools are funded by how many kids they've got the year prior. So they're funded on the August age grade census, as well as the census at the start of term 1. They get an average of those students and then get applied the appropriate weightings across the board to give them the next year's budget. As the student numbers change, as we're expecting year 10s and an evolving cohort, we are modelling what the predicted movement of students are and then what the funding that would be attributable to that number of kids. So when Centralia Middle moves to a 7 to 10 school in 2027, we'll have a budget that will support the 7 to 9s as well as the expected number of year 10s. When the school year starts, and if we get more kids than what we're expecting, then we'll have an opportunity to allocate additional funding into those schools. If there's less kids, we'll maintain the funding to ensure that we can best support or set up those programs as necessary. Each year, we're going to review the model to make sure that our predictions are working as they should be, and fund schools on the basis of what they've got the prior year, but also then what we're expecting the next year. On through all of this, we appreciate that some of the schools may start relatively small. So schools like Nightcliff, which has a relatively small year 9 cohort, might expect that they'd have a very small year 10 cohort, but we want to make sure those schools are sustainable through this change. So we have allocated additional funding to support supplementary funding on top of what would come through the school resourcing model to support schools to staff to the level they need to deliver the curriculum for those year 10s or for the grades as they emerge. So we'll keep that funding rolling throughout this program just to make sure that schools are getting enough to be sustainable as their enrolments settle as well. So that was a very long and complicated answer.
A question, David, from Rowan in the chat.
Not sure yet, Rowan, how that transition will work for staff. And I guess this is why we've got the year of planning next year as we best support. I will assume that as the year 10 cohort starts at Centralia Middle, we'll have staff moving and providing their senior secondary expertise into the Centralian Middle School. The extent of those movements, not yet sure, because we're not sure what the cohort looks like yet. Thanks, Steph.
And David, I think that's been a common question around, and it's good to hear about the supplementary funding, and we might have a deeper conversation as the members' representative, because with funding based on enrolment and the plan to offer a quality education in all streams and all levels as we transition, that supplementary funding is going to be pretty critical in a very tight space. And I know I can speak for many schools who are looking at funding crunch at the moment, particularly in terms of the department held budgets. The department held budgets, if they're $100,000 or more, will carry into next year. So there does need to be that really close scrutiny, as I'm sure you're aware of, around deficits carrying on year, changes impacting funding coming in. So supplementary funding needs to be quite strong.
Yeah. And appreciate that point, Michelle, around deficits. It doesn't make sense to me that we provide supplementary funding whilst also holding a debt against the school. So I'll certainly be doing what I can to try and address that practice. I didn't have to answer your final question, Anna, when you're going to know about it. So we are doing the work now, and it'll be formally part of the budgeting process in September and October, but we'll hope to start consulting with school leadership around what prospective budgets might be from next month sometime. I'll go to Robert and then to Damien. I appreciate, Damien, you put your hand up and put it down, but I think Robert gazumped you now.
Okay, all good.
Robert?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. My question is based on student numbers per class. I'm from Darwin Middle School, and my concern is that because this has taken so long, I'm going to lose a lot of year 9s to other schools like CDU or Darwin High. What is my daughter or to expect from numbers that she's allowed in classes before they start cutting classes for student numbers? I haven't really seen or heard anything about that in previous conversations. So I was just wondering how that's going to work in the future.
Yeah, so what we've committed to across the board is to provide enough funding, which would support enough staff to support delivery of all of the required lines around year 10 for the transition schools next year. So Robert, did you say you're from Darwin Middle or Dripstone Middle?
Dripstone at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to keep it going. We just don't want to get her involved in a class and then find out that because there's only 2 or 3 students wanting that elective or class, that they don't offer it after us committing to stay. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And so we are really aware that there are concerns around some of those minimum cohort sizes for next year in year 10 and have committed across Dripstone, Nightcliff and Sanderson particularly that will support the delivery of the ACARA curriculum as well as electives and the start of the stage 1 subject. So if next year it turns out the cohort, the number of year 10s is less than expected, we'll continue the funding just to make sure that those schools sustain the delivery so that they can succeed in the future. So for some of those schools, it might mean they end up with a very small year 12 cohort in 2028 as it moves through, but the department is committed to make sure those year 12s have those opportunities that they get at the other schools. The other part of the conversation was around how schools might better work together and share their resources across the school. So your principal, Nectaria at Dripstone, as well as Eva at Nightcliff and Robert Sanderson, have been talking about how, as potentially smaller comprehensive schools, they might offer the same electives and lines that are available at the larger schools and how they might do that through the sharing of resources. There's also an opportunity for some of our larger schools like Darwin High or Casuarina Senior College to also share their teaching expertise and particularly their leading teacher expertise to help some of the smaller schools to set up. But we have made the commitment that we'll sustain the cohort size through this transitional period, and we're expecting that to last between 3 and 5 years as the schools, as the enrolment stabilises across the board.
Okay, cheers. Thanks for that.
Damien. It's a nice bit of art you've got in your telephone.
Oh, thank you, sir. It's one of my hobbies I like to do after school. But my question, you can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Perfect. My question, going back to the Palmerston region in particular, and how it's divided up into the 2 areas. And I know a lot of people in the community have voice. People that I've worked with are saying that that's where all the First Nation kids are going this side because it's a very low social economic area, you know, those Malden drivers, Grey and whatnot. And then the other side of Palmerston, you're going to the other campus. And there's been lots of discussion around the community about what's going to happen with that. Why is it like that? Are there more support in place for those First Nation kids at the senior campus where it's going to be located for those families?
Yeah, thanks, Damien. And it is a good question and something that we've been working through for the planning. So the reason the priority enrolment areas look like they do is there's a couple of reasons. One is to align to where the existing primary schools go. So to make sure that our feeds are really clear, but also those priority enrolment areas are based on the relative proximity. So how far students would need to travel to get to the schools. If you drew a line equidistant between Driver and Rosebery campus, it would pretty much line up along Chunghwa Terrace between those two schools. So we didn't want kids that lived next to the Driver school having to tramp across town to attend the Rosebery school or vice versa. What are the things that we're going to need to manage in this transition is the Driver campus, because of its relative advantage or socioeconomic status, will attract a higher level of funding than the Rosebery campus by the virtue of the way our school resourcing model works. So we'll make sure that the Driver campus has sufficient funding to support a cohort with a different socioeconomic background than those attending the Rosebery campus. So part of that's through sort of whole school behavioural approaches, through better community partnerships, but also through specialisations that best match the aspirations of the kids. So we already talked a little bit about the new skills centre. There's an opportunity if the parents and the kids at Driver want to take a more vocational focus or want to focus on a specialisation that's different to Rosebery, then we'd support them to explore that as well. But yes, it's do appreciate that the older suburbs of Palmerston around Malden, Woodruff, Grey and Driver are also lower or have lower socioeconomic characteristics than the newer suburbs on the eastern side. Other questions? Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, David. If no one else has any, I might just run through some that that have come through. So I might just keep going, and if anyone wants to pop their hand up, I'm happy to stop. Some of the questions around parent and school body involvement, and I apologise, my camera, the roving camera isn't working, so you're looking at a big room. What is the process for the department for involving school councils and boards in decisions relating to any structural or identity changes? So the expectation of the department for involvement of those school bodies rather than things like name changes being school-led. Can I just start with that one, David?
Yeah, certainly, Michelle, and I think it will depend on what the change is that we're proposing. So school council chairs should have received a letter from the department outlining, and I'm looking at my chairs to see whether they have so far or whether I need to follow up on it, which outlines what's proposed for the school, but also includes an offer from the department to attend the next or future council meeting to work through what the change looks like. We'll be trying to work with the school councils at each of the affected schools individually around what the changes are that are happening at that schools, as well as the opportunities they've got to provide input into those changes. So names are a big one. We're reliant on the school community, principals as well as councils to make recommendations about what the names of the schools should be. Some of those schools, I think, have been having that conversation for quite a while. I know Sanderson's been talking about it for a long time. And those recommendations will then come into the department, go through our place, no, not through the NT Government's Place Names Committee, and then into our Minister for the final determination of the name, which we're hoping is gazetted by September. For other changes like school budgeting, that's always part of our engagement around school planning, as well as the infrastructure refurbishments and upgrades that are required. We'd be engaging with school councils around what those look like in each site.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think it was more around those identity changes and recognising, you and I have had conversations, recognising for the 2 campuses at Palmerston, there'll need to be some parent advisory groups, for example, to feed in, support the school, and any comms that you're getting out to school that, thanks, Chris, that also let schools know that the expectation is that school councils and boards and the wider community would be involved as well. I think we've covered really well the changes to school governance, and I'll get out the list of information that I sent through to you in April. I'll get that out to everybody else. School uniforms, will families be financially supported if uniform changes are introduced? Was a question that came forward. So I'll mark that as a comment. There was some questions around support in place for students transitioning, and you did mention in your presentation, David, around support services for students transitioning and recognising, of course, for students with additional needs and vulnerable students. Are you able just to elaborate on the support services a bit deeper than that line that was in the presentation?
Yeah, I'll elaborate a little, Michelle. So we are looking at each of the schools and their feeder primaries, and we'll be supporting those schools to make sure they're communicating well with the feeder primaries, but also have an appropriate transition process in place for most of the kids. So for those who are unaware, most secondary schools already have a program where the kids in year 6 get to go on campus and experience those sites, as well as learn what happens at high school. We'll be working across the board to support schools to do that. In addition, we're working with our colleagues in student wellbeing to design specific support for students with disabilities, to make sure that their parents are aware of what options they have, as well as what are the opportunities in this transition. That support's going to be more targeted based on the students we know that are transitioning through, and making sure we've got a plan in place to support the conversations with their parents around their options and the adjustments that will need to be made as they move into school. It will be in addition to what we'd usually do, because we're really conscious we don't want kids to fall between the cracks here.
Great, thanks, David. And will there be guidelines? We went through this years ago in Central, where there were some enrolment boundary changes. Will there be guidelines to support schools around enrolment practices where you might have siblings, a student entering into a different school potentially? And is there leeway and flexibility around that for sibling groups?
Yeah, so priority enrolment policy is not proposed to change through this process. So the policy at the moment is that the students that live within the priority enrolment area for a school have priority access to that school. So the local government school must take them. For students that live outside of the priority enrolment area, there's a number of different factors schools need to consider in accepting them as students at their school. So one of those factors is the family. So if you have siblings at the school, most schools consider that sufficient to support their enrolment. What we've been working on with the Darwin principles and Palmerston principle in particular is around how we make the practice of enrolment more consistent across the board, and provide really clear advice to parents and to students about how priority enrolment works, but also what their opportunities are. The NT school system is fairly unique across Australia, in that we've got the wonderful opportunity for students and parents to choose a number of different options for their school, and in most cases, or in many cases, we can accommodate those options. So within any school's priority enrolment area, roughly about half of the kids choose to go somewhere else. So whether that's through to non-government or to another government school, it's about half that aren't accessing their local school because of the other opportunities that are available. The exceptions to this will be schools that are constrained in their capacity. So Darwin Middle has been under a priority enrolment management plan for the last few years, as it reached its infrastructure capacity, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, and that's not likely to change next year. So the same processes will apply. Darwin Middle have applied previously, which is that they need to make sure that they're not accepting more kids than their infrastructure can take. Schools like the proposed technical college at Sanderson will be selective entry for students that want to explore specific trade pathways. So we'll work out what those pathways are, but the model works in other jurisdictions based on the students' desire to access a particular vocational pathway, and then an aptitude test almost to see whether they're suited for that pathway. So for Sanderson, the technical college will be focused on kids that want to explore those jobs. For Casuarina, there won't be a priority enrolment area, as their focus will be on those higher education pathways, and will be but they will be open to enrolments from students that want to access those pathways in particular, or specifically those pathways. So, and that would be from across the territory, not just within the northern suburbs of Darwin.
Right, thanks, David. And lastly from me, and principal recruitment, when is that expected to kick off?
So we're expecting the first round to go out later this week. So we are having conversations with affected principals at the moment around what the transitional leadership will look like before we advertise positions. So we'll be advertising at the end of this week the position of transitional principal at Darwin. So that would sit across for next year, both the Darwin High and Darwin Middle, to do the legwork necessary with the two schools to bring them to the fully integrated state. And we'll be advertising the principal of the Rosebery campus, or of the new Rosebery High School, later this week, we're hoping.
Right.
Also have established for those from Central still on the line, established a transitional position for Centralian, a transitional principal position for Centralian, and we'll be recruiting to that later in the year. So probably in term 4, recruiting to that position to start at the start of 2026.
Thanks, Dave. Just to clarify, a transitional principal for Darwin High and Middle,
yep.
And there remains a principal for Darwin High and a principal for Darwin Middle.
For next year, yes.
For next year, thank you.
Yep.
Believe it or not, that's everything from me.
We haven't even run out of time yet.
I know, you've done brilliant. Has anybody got any last minute burning things that you want to ask and just check on? I mean, obviously from our perspective, we're about schools and families working in partnership, and as much as we can be consulted and be supporting our schools on behalf of our students, making sure that you're getting enough information, making sure the department is supporting the schools in the best way they can, given that this is additional load on top of very, very busy worlds that our principals work in. So I'm sure David would welcome any other feedback or any other questions. If not right now, he'd be happy for you to channel them to us as you might think of them, and we could feed them back. Does that sound workable, David?
Yeah, that sounds fine, and always happy to meet with school representative bodies and boards as well. I've just popped a link into the chat, which is where the individual school information is. So there's fact sheets available for each of the schools that are proposed or that we're working towards, as well as some general information about what it looks like as a region. Parents should expect to receive something from their school. Yes, Helen, you did hear correctly that Darwin High and Darwin Middle will commence with separate budgets. That's what we're proposing. Parents at the impacted schools, so the middle and secondary schools, should have received some information this afternoon. And if you haven't, I'll follow up with your principals that we're going to get that out through Compass or whatever parent communication mechanism they use. And parents at the feeder primary school should also expect to receive, if you haven't received already, a fact sheet from your local secondary school about the proposed changes and how that impacts on your school and what the, I guess, what the path is for your students next year. So I'll ask if anyone hasn't received that information through the channels of your school. If you don't have it by tomorrow, please feel free to reach out and I can follow up with school principals to make sure they've got that information out and about. At the same time, we've communicated with staff around these changes and we'll keep that line of communication open because I appreciate we've probably got some teachers and parents on the line today.
Great. And just clarification for everybody, often the top end, north of the Berrimah line, CSC is also Centralian Senior College, not just Casuarina Senior College.
Yeah, got that from Annie. Anna.
Yeah. Well, if there isn't anything else, please do stick your hand up. But just while I say a massive thank you to David, who from COGSO's perspective, the president and myself have had several online meetings with David. He committed to those weekly. He's been agreeable each time we've said, can we quickly do this? It was very short notice for today, and we really do thank you, David, because members were really keen to hear as soon as term 3 commenced. It just happened to coincide with today's announcement, which was fortuitous. And if there is a need as we get further down the track, I'm sure David would be willing to avail himself again as we get into the nitty gritty around staffing and programs and start to roll out. Obviously for Darwin and for Centralian, they'll be busy planning for another year, and we'll be able to learn from, what does the department say, David? We'll take the learnings from everybody else's experience. But please don't hesitate to get in touch if your school rep body has any questions. We'll also be really focused on primary school communities as well, because that's where lots of questions will be rising as information will be circulating. So on behalf of COGSO, David, I want to thank you for your collaboration. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. You really do understand the budget constraints and the different things. You do have a really good family and parent focus and lens with what you do, and we are very, very grateful. So thank you, David.